I know that Mr. Sharpe planned this assault in great detail, and what has been described in this hearing is almost a militaristic planning style. I know that Mr. Sharpe carefully planned how he would get multiple weapons into this school successfully. I know Mr. Sharpe engaged in a ruse with the bus driver that allowed him to bring a golf bag full of weapons and full of ammunition on the school bus. And on that day of the shooting, he provided friendly greetings to the bus driver while entering and exiting the bus. That is, nothing at all in his behavior on September 13th, 2017 to those who observed him prior caused any concern. Bus driver had no reason to be concerned that day. When the alarm was going off in the distance as she was cleaning out the bus, she didn't even suspect that it was because the school was on lockdown. I know that Mr. Sharpe drew a map of the Freeman campus and planned in detail exactly how he would enter the building that day, and specifically what route he would take from the bus stop directly to the door he planned to enter, and the stairs he would climb to the hallway where he knew potentially hundreds of students would be gathering on that day. Somehow, Mr. Sharpe was able to learn the combination of the gun safe at the family home, and that weapons and ammunition were not inadvertently or carelessly left out for him to access. Instead, Mr. Sharpe sought out and specifically availed himself of weapons and ammunition that he would take to Freeman School. I also know that when Mr. Sharpe was in place at Freeman School on the day in question, he calmly began unloading his weapons and appeared to make no attempt to conceal what he was doing at all. So much so that when Mr. Strahan approached Mr. Sharpe and spoke to him, Mr. Sharpe's demeanor and his mannerisms were so calm and methodical that Mr. Strahan was completely unaware of the peril he faced. I also know that when Mr. Sharpe shot Mr. Strahan in the abdomen, he didn't stop or otherwise take a step back and reconsider his extraordinary actions. Instead, he followed up. He shot Mr. Strahan in the right cheek, all but guaranteeing that Mr. Strahan would die. I also know that at this point, Mr. Sharpe, clearly aware that he had taken a life, began to methodically fire his Colt .32 caliber handgun at students who were gathered in the second floor hallway, striking 3 students. The shooting with the Colt .32 caliber did not stop until Mr. Sharpe ran out of ammunition. I also know that in further preparation for this shooting, Mr. Sharpe shaved his head and had at some point drawn an X across the face of a number of students in the Freeman High School yearbook and had written the word "kill," as well as writing out in detail what appears to be a recipe for a homemade bomb. I also know that on September 12th, 2017, one day before this shooting, Mr. Sharpe's final determining factor in deciding whether to carry out this attack was a coin toss. A coin toss to decide if Mr. Sharpe's Freeman High School classmates would live or if they would die. Sadly, we know what the result of that coin toss was. I do feel compelled, however, to say how much this case has affected Spokane County as a whole, and primarily the Freeman community. And that cannot be overstated. One witness after another testified that they will never be the same. And Freeman will never be the same. How can a teacher or a Freeman faculty member walk down that second floor hallway ever again without being reminded of the profound events that took place there?
There will be a constant memory of it. I can't go upstairs without seeing it in my head on any given day.
Just minutes before he found 15-year-old Sam lying in that hallway, the custodian confronted Caleb Sharpe, the boy who admitted pulling the trigger, taking Sam's life.
I said, "I have the shooter. I have the shooter." Immediately upon realizing this is a shooting, and the girls are in distress, I looked at him, I looked back down the hall, I looked at him, I thought, well, Columbine had 2 shooters. Where's the other one? Looked back at him, ordered him to go to the ground.
All right, and did he comply with that?
No.
Okay, tell the court more.
He stared at me. So I used a little refined language, go to the ground now. And he looked at me, put his hands up, said, okay, reached up, peeled off his Carhartt hat, dropped it to the floor, put his hand up, and went to the floor. I put my knee into his back, my Gerber to his neck, and said, don't move.
Bowen says there are reminders of that day everywhere he looks, like the back door Sharpe walked through before he opened fire.
There are staff members that are pretty scared of that door still, to this day. If that alarm goes off because somebody has bumped it, if anything, they get a little nervous.
Just as he knows this school and the people in it inside and out, he knows their pain. That became clear one morning near the 1-year anniversary of September 13th, 2017. Bowen was opening up the school when he looked down the hallway that changed everything and saw someone kneeling against the wall. Knowing the history, not knowing what he'd find, he turned on the lights, hesitating a bit.
And it was one of the parents having a hard time with the incident, with it being near the anniversary.
Knowing their pain, he did his best to comfort them, despite knowing things would never be the same.
In reality, that's nothing I can do to console anybody, but I tried.
It is now well known, and it is established science, that children's brains do not develop fully until, in general, their mid-20s. The science is clear that adolescent boys in particular, their brains don't develop as rapidly as girls, and now some experts are actually opining that young men do not fully mature in terms of their decision-making abilities until perhaps as late as 30 years old. This simply and clearly shows what we see in our children all the time, and particularly in our teenage children. That is bizarre, foolish, unexplainable, seemingly nonsensical behavior that we as adults would never do. But that's because we are adults in the time sense. Our brains and our decision-making abilities are fully developed. Or said another way, we know better because we're adults. And for the most part, absent exceptional circumstances, we as adults don't have any excuse. But this is precisely why we have adult court and we have juvenile court. It's why we have jail for adults and detention for juveniles. It's why we don't house juveniles and adults together. And in short, it's why we have categorically different penalties that are assessed against juveniles that are profoundly different than criminal penalties assessed against adults. Adults know better. Children, for the most part, do not. So where the law becomes tricky and is subject to significant judicial discretion is thankfully only in those very rare circumstances when a child commits a heinous and horrific crime. In those circumstances, should we impose the same limited penalty upon the juvenile, which traditionally ends at 21, when an adult in the same or similar circumstances could potentially be faced with life in prison? As an adult, these charges are all what we refer to as Class A serious and violent felonies. First-degree murder with aggravating circumstances is, in fact, the most serious charge a person can face in the state of Washington, pursuant to RCW 994A 541A. The minimum term for first-degree murder is 20 years of total confinement. Under the adult sentencing scheme pursuant to the SRA, an adult alleged to have committed the same acts as Mr. Sharpe, if convicted, would be facing a life sentence. Actually, that adult would be facing a number of months that would, without doubt, far exceed a human life. Under a juvenile disposition, which is where this matter currently sits, the total time wherein Mr. Sharpe could be confined pursuant to RCW 1340 is 264 weeks, or 22 months. That is because, since Mr. Sharpe was born on October 10th, 2001, and was arrested on September 13th, 2017, and assuming he is subject to juvenile court jurisdiction, jurisdiction by law must end upon Mr. Sharpe's 21st birthday. Mr. Sharpe has had absolutely no contact with law enforcement or the juvenile court. Nothing. He's not on anybody's radar. No disciplinary notices or reprimands at school. If one expected that we would hear a history of trouble or concerns about Mr. Sharpe that should have been clear to everyone that knew him, there's absolutely nothing at all that the court heard that would suggest that. I've heard about videos Mr. Sharpe made, and videos and documentaries about school shootings that he watched that are perhaps concerning, and video games he played that are very violent. But that said, how many kids are out there watching videos just like Mr. Sharpe was watching, and playing video games that are violent just like Mr. Sharpe was playing, and nothing happens? Can these be predictors? Now, there's simply no way to make an absolute and direct correlation. How can anyone realistically fault the Freeman School administration or a school mental health professional for not somehow divining that Mr. Sharpe was planning to commit a mass shooting? Even Mr. Sharpe's parents and siblings were shocked, dismayed by this crime. That's because, while some who testified have described Mr. Sharpe as immature, he was able to carry all of this out with an extraordinary degree of deception, and nobody picked up on it at all. To the court, that actually shows maturity to an extraordinary degree, not immaturity. What Mr. Sharpe was doing with all of those he was close to and whom he interacted with was acting to such a degree that virtually everyone was shocked on September 13th, 2017, that the young man who carried all of this out was Caleb Sharpe. Is it possible for Mr. Sharpe to be rehabilitated? Maybe. But even with the extraordinary array of expert witnesses who I heard from and who I've made clear I have great respect for, no one can guarantee that Mr. Sharpe would not spend his time in juvenile at JRA putting on a happy face. He may even be a model for other juveniles to follow, who seems to have advanced through the system and done well. He's held out at JRA as a successful rehabilitative candidate. Then he gets out at age 21. Remember, that's the maximum that he can be held in the juvenile system. And the next day, he carries out a mass shooting that he's been planning the entire time. Preposterous? Perhaps. Maybe. But who can tell me, who can tell any of us, who can tell the Freeman community that this won't happen again? The only difference that Mr. Sharpe has been given and would have been given by the court if he remained in the juvenile system is more time. More time to analyze his mistakes, more time to perfect his techniques, so that next time it's not one person killed and 3 people shot, maybe it's 100. No one can ever say with certainty that this won't happen again. Mindful of all of this, I am satisfied that when employing a preponderance of the evidence, that the court should order that this matter shall be declined to the jurisdiction of the adult court for all further proceedings.